Hey there. Ready for a deep dive? We're tackling a pretty big topic today. The European Union's economic health.
It's a crucial one, that's for sure.
Absolutely. You sent us this Competitiveness Compass for the EU report, and wow, it's a lot to digest.
It is, yeah. It's dense, but it's really insightful.
It's all about how Europe can, stay competitive on the world stage, and right off the bat, it kind of throws a bit of a punch.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it admits that Europe's been falling behind other big economies for like over 2 decades.
More than 2 decades.
More than 2 decades. And not just like a little bit behind. There's a real gap there, especially when it comes to advanced technologies.
Right, we've been talking about that for a while.
And then, of course, you've got this, giant almost breathing down our necks, China.
So what's the overall vibe here? Is this a the sky is falling kind of thing, or more of a we need to get our act together moment?
Honestly, I'd say it's a wake-up call. The report doesn't sugarcoat anything. It's almost refreshing how directly it points out Europe's shortcomings.
Yeah, it's not pulling any punches. It's not just about falling behind. It's about WHY we're falling behind.
Okay, so let's dig into that why. What's the report's diagnosis?
Well, it points to a few things. One is that we're not very good at turning great ideas into, well, actual products and services that people want to buy.
It's like we're great at research, but not so great at like turning those research papers into successful businesses.
Exactly. And the report kind of hints at why that might be. Europe's patent system, for example. It's so fragmented. A nightmare for startups, especially compared to, say, the US, where it's much more streamlined.
You think that's holding us back?
It definitely makes you wonder, if we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit.
Makes sense. And then, of course, there are the internal hurdles.
Oh, right.
The report doesn't shy away from that. It talks about high energy prices, regulations that maybe weigh down businesses a little too much.
The regulatory burden, as they call it.
Yeah, it's like we're adding to our own challenges sometimes.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. The report doesn't just dwell on the negatives.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a silver lining.
Oh, there's big silver lining. It highlights Europe's strengths, too. We've got a skilled workforce, that massive single market, and a solid foundation based on law and stability. So these are huge GE advantages.
Those are some serious assets.
And the report sees real potential for the EU to be a leader, not just in innovation, but in sustainable growth, too. It lays out this new model for competitiveness based on what they call innovation-led productivity.
So it's not just about catching up. It's about setting the pace.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a much more optimistic outlook. But how do we get from potential to reality? What's the roadmap here?
Well, the report outlines 3 areas where Europe needs a total transformation. First up, closing that innovation gap we were just talking about. It's not enough to have brilliant ideas. We need to turn them into products and technologies people want to buy.
And it feels like we're maybe dropping the ball there, especially when it comes to startups. The report even mentions that a lot of promising startups end up moving to the US for better opportunities. Ouch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a real problem. And the report digs into why that's happening. One big factor is access to funding. The EU's share of global venture capital funds is only 5%,
5%.
compared to 52% in the US.
Whoa. Talk about an uneven playing field.
Like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's not just about needing more money. It's about making sure that money actually reaches the startups that need it.
Exactly. And the report proposes something called a dedicated EU startup and scale-up strategy to tackle this.
Okay, so what's in this strategy? How do we close that funding gap?
Well, one idea that caught my eye is this 28th legal regime. I know it sounds bureaucratic, but
Yeah, a little bit.
stick with me here. It basically means creating a single set of rules for startups across the entire EU market. Think about what that would mean for a sector like fintech. Right now, they have to navigate 27 different legal systems. It's insane.
Whoa, a single set of rules for the entire EU. That would be like
A game changer.
huge. It's almost like the EU is finally saying, hey, maybe we've made things way too complicated and we need to simplify things if we want to compete.
Right, it could level the playing field with the US in terms of ease of doing business.
Okay, so less paperwork, more funding. Got it. What else is in this strategy to boost innovation?
Well, the report goes beyond just startups. It pushes for a big increase in research and development spending. They're aiming for 3% of GDP.
3%, that's ambitious.
It is. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about focusing on high-impact projects, coordinating research efforts across the EU, and figuring out how to smoothly transition research from the lab to, well, real-world applications.
So like targeting the entire innovation pipeline.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's closing the innovation gap. What's the second area for transformation?
The second area focuses on decarbonization and, maybe surprisingly, competitiveness.
Decarbonization and competitiveness. Those feel kind of, I don't know, at odds sometimes.
I know, right? But the EU has these ambitious climate goals, and the report is saying we need to figure out how to go green without sacrificing our economic edge.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. It's that whole idea that going green often seems to come with a hefty price tag, and that makes businesses, well, nervous.
Exactly. Especially with those high energy prices we were talking about earlier, European companies are already feeling squeezed compared to their competitors in other parts of the world.
Right, so how do we square that circle?
The report acknowledges that tension directly. They even propose this Affordable Energy Action Plan.
Affordable Energy Action Plan. I like the sound of that.
The key is speeding up the transition to clean energy sources, especially electrifying our economy.
Imagine a Europe where clean energy is abundant and affordable. Sign me up.
Right. And to get there, they're talking about things like streamlining those annoying network tariffs, integrating the energy market more effectively, and making it easier for everyone to access low-cost, clean energy sources.
So it's not just about saving the planet. It's about making sure Europe doesn't get left behind in the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to make that switch to clean production even more appealing, they suggest developing what they call lead markets.
Lead market.
Yeah, and policies that reward early adopters of clean technologies. Think demand incentives, support for companies producing those technologies, and a more flexible approach to state aid that encourages investment in going green.
Okay, so kind of like a carrot and stick approach.
Yeah, something like that. Make
Yep.
it easier and more profitable to go green, and maybe companies will be less resistant to change.
Makes sense. But what about those industries that are like essential but notoriously energy hungry? I'm talking about things like steel, metals, chemicals. They're the backbone of European manufacturing, but going green for them seems like a massive challenge.
You're right, those are tough nuts to crack. And the report gets pretty specific, calling for tailored action plans for each of these sectors. Like for steel and metals, for example. They're proposing a plan that addresses their investment needs, secures access to raw materials, and even includes trade defense measures.
Wow. Sounds like they're trying to create a safety net for those industries as they make the transition. But I can already hear the pushback. Change is never easy, especially when jobs and profits are on the line.
For sure, it's going to be a balancing act.
Yeah.
But the report really stresses that it's not an either-or situation. We can have a thriving industrial sector and a sustainable future. In fact, they argue that the two go hand in hand.
Okay, so that's innovation and decarbonization. What's the third pillar of this transformation? What else is on Europe's to-do list?
The third one is all about reducing our dependencies, really boosting that security. It's like recognizing that the world's getting more complex, and Europe needs to be smarter about its place in it.
This is where things get interesting, almost like geopolitical, right? I mean, it's not a secret that the EU relies on, well, imports for a lot of crucial things.
Oh, yeah.
Energy being like the most obvious example. And, recent events, especially what's happening in Ukraine, have really shown us just how vulnerable we are.
For sure.
Like really vulnerable.
A report goes right into that, acknowledges that this over-reliance on imports for things like raw materials, technology, even medicine,
Right.
it put us in a risky position, to say the least.
It's like you suddenly realize your house is built on like shaky ground.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just about, one bad actor out there. Global supply chains are super complex. Disruptions can happen for all sorts of reasons. It feels like we've been taking a gamble, assuming everything will always be fine.
And the report is kind of like a slap in the face to that complacency.
Yeah.
It advocates for what they call open strategic autonomy.
Open strategic autonomy. That sounds kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It might sound like that, yeah. But the idea is to be open to trade and collaboration. But they also have the ability to, well, act independently when we need to.
Okay, so like having a plan B, just in case.
Exactly, like that saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially when that basket might have holes in it.
Especially when that basket might have holes. Love that. Okay, but what does open strategic autonomy actually look like in real life? What are they suggesting we do?
One big part is diversifying our trade partners. The report really pushes for strong trade agreements, but not just any agreements. They're talking about what they call clean trade and investment partnerships.
Clean trade and investment partnerships.
They go beyond those typical trade deals. It's about combining rules, investments, regulatory cooperation,
Yeah.
all to secure those essential supply chains for things like raw materials and, crucial technologies.
Okay, so it's about being choosy about who we do business with, building more resilient supply chains with partners we can trust.
Exactly. But it's not all about, like, finding new friends. It's also about dealing with those who don't always play fair. The report talks about this concern of, well, unfair competition from countries that engage in practices like state-backed overinvestment, subsidies that, mess up global markets.
Right. It's like trying to play a game where the other team is allowed to cheat. You can't really compete under those conditions.
Exactly. And they propose a multi-pronged approach to tackle this, using existing trade defense tools, enforcing those regulations on foreign subsidies more strictly, even pushing for a stronger WTO rulebook that, really addresses these issues head on. It's about sticking up for European businesses, making sure they're not being unfairly undercut.
It's a tough stance, for sure, but it feels necessary. If you want to play in the global arena, you got to be ready to fight for your interests.
Exactly. The report also explores ways to increase the EU's leverage in those international markets. One interesting idea is a platform for joint purchases of critical raw materials.
Joint purchases.
Yeah. So by, combining their demand, EU countries could negotiate better prices, get those more stable supplies, strengthen numbers, right?
Makes sense. But it's not just about external threats. The report also talks about the role of, well, the public sector in supporting European businesses. Something about a European preference in public procurement, particularly for those strategic sectors and technologies.
Right. Think about it. Public procurement represents a massive part of the EU economy. Giving preference to European companies when awarding those government contracts, that could really boost our domestic industries, right?
That's a powerful tool.
And they want to simplify those rules around public procurement too, especially for those agile startups, innovative companies, making it easier for them to, get their foot in the door.
So it's about using the EU's buying power strategically. Support our own businesses, encourage innovation. Makes sense. But let's talk about defense for a second. The report highlights the defense industry specifically as this crucial element of overall competitiveness and innovation. It's an interesting connection that you might not, immediately think of.
Yeah, it's not the first thing that comes to mind, is it? But the report makes this argument that, well, while the European defense industry is important, it's also fragmented
Yeah.
and underinvested.
So we're not making the most of our potential there.
Exactly. The argument is that a stronger, more integrated European defense industry, well, it wouldn't just boost our security. It could also drive those technological advancements that benefit the whole economy. Think about the spillover effects of innovation in areas like aerospace, cybersecurity, advanced materials. A rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Exactly. A rising tide lifts all boats. So what are they proposing? How do we make that happen?
The report calls for deeper cooperation between EU countries on defense. Things like joint procurement, research and development, even creating a single market for defense.
A single market for defense.
To get those economies of scale and boost innovation. But it's not just about, traditional security threats anymore, is it?
It feels like the world's gotten a lot more complicated. The pandemic, the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine.
Right. And the report takes this broader view, recognizing how important it is to be prepared for all sorts of challenges, from cyber attacks and pandemics to, of course, climate change.
It seems like the EU has, well, learned some hard lessons from recent crises, those vulnerabilities we can't afford to ignore.
Exactly. They're advocating for this preparedness union strategy. It's not just about reacting to crises anymore. It's about anticipating them, building that resilience across every part of society.
So being proactive, not reactive. That makes sense, but it also sounds like a massive undertaking.
It's a big shift in mindset for sure, both individually and, at the institutional level. But the report argues it's essential for Europe's long-term stability, for our prosperity.
Okay, so we've talked about innovation, decarbonization, strategic autonomy, even defense. But what about the people? All of these plans, all of these strategies, ultimately they depend on having a skilled and adaptable workforce, right?
You hit the nail on the head. The report really stresses that people are at the heart of Europe's competitiveness. It's not just about technology or regulations. It's about investing in our human capital.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers, forget that the economy is really about people.
Right. And they're calling for a union of skills that focuses on education, training, promoting lifelong learning, attracting talented folks from abroad, and, making the labor market more inclusive.
It's about giving people the tools to thrive in a world that's changing, well, faster than ever before.
Exactly. But Europe also has these demographic challenges, right? A shrinking working age population. That's not exactly a recipe for economic growth.
Not ideal. No.
But they address that too. They propose ways to increase labor market participation, particularly among women, young folks, and, older citizens.
So getting everyone involved.
Exactly. Things like making childcare and elder care more accessible, promoting those flexible work arrangements, modernizing social protection systems. It's about recognizing that a strong economy requires a healthy and inclusive society.
They're connected.
Totally. They argue that a more competitive economy leads to higher productivity, and that makes it possible to maintain a strong social safety net, create opportunities for everyone. They emphasize quality jobs, decent wages, work-life balance, fair working conditions.
It's not just about creating more jobs. It's about creating good jobs, jobs that benefit everyone.
Exactly. A virtuous cycle where economic competitiveness and social well-being, reinforce each other.
Okay, that's a really compelling vision, but all of these ambitious plans, it's got to come with a hefty price tag. Where's all money going to come from?
Well, the report estimates that we need an additional 750 to 800 billion euros of investment per year by 2030 to reach these targets. It's a lot, no doubt, but they propose a multifaceted approach, both public and private investment.
So it's not just about government spending, it's about attracting private capital as well.
Absolutely. They talk about creating this savings and investments union to mobilize private capital more effectively and refocusing the EU budget to, really prioritize those projects that boost competitiveness.
Being smarter with our money, finding ways to unlock those private investments. What are some of the mechanisms they propose?
They mention a new European Competitiveness Fund
Okay.
to support strategic technologies, manufacturing, research, and innovation, and those large-scale, cross-border projects.
Sounds ambitious.
They also want to use the European Investment Bank and other financial institutions to, de-risk projects, making them more attractive to private investors.
So kind of creating a more favorable investment environment in Europe, but it's not just about the money, right? It's about coordination too, making sure everyone's working together.
You're absolutely right. The report emphasizes that to achieve all of this, we need to change how the EU and its member states work together.
Working smarter, not harder, as they say.
They propose a new competitiveness coordination tool to align those industrial and research policies, coordinate investments, and create this more strategic and, integrated approach to competitiveness.
So breaking down those silos, getting everyone on the same page, making sure our actions actually line up with our goals.
Exactly. The report is really clear that Europe can only succeed if it acts as one. Pooling our resources, our expertise, our, political will to achieve those common goals. It's a huge challenge, no doubt, but the stakes are high.
And the report frames competitiveness not just as an economic imperative, but as something essential for, preserving Europe's way of life, our social model, our ability to play a leading role on the world stage.
It's a powerful argument. In a world that's, becoming more complex and more competitive every day, Europe really needs to step up its game if we want to protect our interests, our values, everything we stand for.
Yeah, it really feels like they're saying, look, we need to be competitive if we want to protect what we stand for.
You got it. The report actually says Europe's competitiveness and what Europe stands for are inseparable. It's not about, just getting richer for the sake of it.
It's about having the power to protect our way of life. Our social model being able to play a role globally.
Exactly. It's like economic power and geopolitical power, they're totally tied together now.
So this deep dive has been, eye-opening to say the least. This report is huge, packed with data, recommendations. It's like a snapshot of Europe at this crossroads.
Definitely.
We're facing these big challenges, but also these amazing opportunities. What stands out to you? What's the most important takeaway?
I think it's the focus on working together, collaboration. The report keeps saying Europe can only achieve these goals if we're all on the same page.
Yeah, that makes sense. It can't just be top-down from Brussels. It's got to be a team effort. Everyone has to feel ownership.
For sure. The report talks about empowering people, giving them the skills and opportunities to succeed in this crazy, fast-changing world.
Creating a society where everyone feels included, supported, and, able to contribute. That really resonates with me. If Europe wants to be truly competitive, it can't just be about the numbers. It's about building a society that's fair and inclusive and sustainable.
Couldn't agree more. It's about creating a Europe that's not just economically successful, but resilient, secure, and just.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive, and it's clear the EU's at a turning point. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on things and seeing how it all plays out.
It's going to be fascinating. That's for sure.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, keep those sources coming. We're always ready to dive deep into whatever you throw our way.
Absolutely. Always ready.